The lie began with a letter that wasn't mine. It arrived on a Tuesday, the kind of bleak, damp morning in 1899 that seeped through the cracks in the window frame and settled deep in your bones. The envelope was thick, expensive cream parchment that felt alien in my chapped hands. The wax seal was a deep, unforgiving black, stamped with the silhouette of a sprawling manor I didn't recognise, but it was the name that stopped the air in my lungs. Miss Evelina Ward. My name is Evelyn Wren. The difference was a single vowel, and a world of opportunity. I read the letter 3 times, my stomach twisting into a knot so tight it hurt. It was a formal offer of employment, a position as a private companion to a Mrs. Langston of Langston Hall, Berkshire. The duties were vague: reading aloud, accompanying her on walks, offering quiet company. The salary, however, was painfully specific. It was a sum that could buy me a new coat, a warm room for the winter, and 3 hot meals a day for a year. It was a fortune. It was a lifeline. It was also meant for another woman. I told myself it wasn't lying if I intended to tell the truth. Eventually. A foolish, flimsy excuse, but it was all I had. My landlord had given me until the end of the week. My savings consisted of a few coins that rattled with a lonely, mocking sound in my pocket. At 24, I was a clergyman's daughter, educated enough to know poetry, but too poor to afford pride. Desperation is a key that can open any door, even one that leads straight to ruin. I wrote back that same day, my hand trembling as I signed a name that felt like a betrayal on my tongue. Evelina Ward. A week later, a carriage arrived. It wasn't a hired cab. It was a private coach, the kind I'd only ever seen in illustrations, pulled by 2 magnificent black horses that steamed in the cold air. The carriage smelled of lavender and old leather and nerves. Mostly mine. As it pulled away from the grimy London streets, leaving behind the only life I'd ever known, a single thought echoed with the rhythm of the horse's hooves. Turn back, turn back, turn back. But I didn't. I couldn't. The journey into the Berkshire countryside was a descent into silence. The city's noise faded, replaced by a thick, rolling mist that clung to the fields and swallowed the trees whole. It felt like the world was disappearing behind me, leaving nothing ahead but this enormous, terrifying choice. I practiced my new name in a whisper, the sound absorbed by the velvet cushions. I am Evelina Ward. It felt like trying on a gown that didn't fit, the seams pulling in all the wrong places. My backstory was thin, a patchwork of half-truths I'd stitched together in the dead of night. My parents had passed. I was seeking quiet employment. I was discreet. I hoped it would be enough. If my life depended on first impressions, I'd have perished years ago. After what felt like an eternity, the carriage slowed, turning onto a long, winding drive. Giant, skeletal oak trees formed a canopy overhead, their bare branches clawing at the grey sky. And then I saw it. Langston Hall. It wasn't a house. It was a tombstone, a colossal monument of grey stone and dark, watching windows. Ivy clung to its walls like a disease, and the air around it was heavy, still. The house didn't just stand there. It loomed. It watched. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. I'd made a terrible, irreversible mistake. The carriage door opened. A stoic driver offered a gloved hand, his face a mask of indifference. The air that hit my face was sharp and cold, smelling of wet earth and decay. I took his hand and stepped onto the gravel, my worn boots looking pathetic against the grandeur of the entrance. The great oak doors were carved with stern-faced angels who looked like they knew every sin I'd ever committed, starting with the one I was living right now. The door swung open before I reached it, revealing a butler who was even older and colder than the stone angels. He was tall, and thin as a rail, his face etched with a permanent look of disapproval. He didn't ask my name. He simply looked me up and down, a flicker of something. Disappointment? Confusion? In his pale eyes. "You are expected," he said, his voice the dry rustle of dead leaves. He led me inside. If the outside was imposing, the inside was suffocating. A grand foyer stretched before me. its marble floor so polished I could see the ghost of my own reflection. A cavernous silence filled the space, broken only by the funereal tick-tock of a grandfather clock in the corner. The air was still, heavy with the scent of beeswax and something else. Something like regret. The servants I glimpsed in the hallways moved like spectres, their eyes downcast, their footsteps silent. They watched me like a ghost who refused to stay in the attic. The butler led me to a drawing room. "Wait here. Mrs. Langston will be with you shortly." He left, closing the heavy doors behind him, and leaving me alone in a room that felt like a museum exhibit. The furniture was draped in white sheets, and a layer of dust coated every surface except for a small, cleared area around the fireplace. It was a house that was either being packed up or had given up altogether. I didn't have to wait long. The doors opened again, and a woman entered. She moved with a fluid, chilling grace, her black silk dress making no sound on the wooden floor. She was tall and slender, her hair a perfect silver crown, her face a masterpiece of aristocratic beauty frozen by grief or bitterness. I couldn't tell which. This had to be Mrs. Langston. If silence were currency, she would be the richest woman in England. She stopped a few feet from me, her dark eyes scanning me from head to toe. She didn't look at me. She assessed me, like a piece of furniture she wasn't sure she wanted to keep. "Miss Ward," she said. Her voice was low and smooth, but with an edge of brittle ice. "You are younger than I anticipated." My throat was dry. "I am 24, madam." "I see." She didn't seem pleased. She circled me slowly, her gaze so intense I felt like a specimen under glass. "The agency spoke highly of your quiet disposition. Langston Hall requires quiet. We do not abide drama here." "I am a very quiet person," I managed to say, the lie feeling small and pathetic in the vast empty room. She nodded, though it seemed to cost her an effort. "You will have your meals with us? My son and I dine at 8. You will be expected to be punctual." She gestured vaguely toward the door. "Riggs will show you to your room. Unpack, rest, be ready by 8. It was a dismissal. I felt a surge of relief so strong it almost made me dizzy. I had passed the first test. She hadn't seen through me. As I turned to leave, she spoke again, her voice stopping me cold. "One more thing, Miss Ward." I turned back. Her eyes were narrowed, a flicker of something dark and unsettling in their depths. "Your resemblance to a previous guest is quite remarkable. I trust it will not be a problem." Before I could ask what she meant, the doors opened again. This time, a man stood in the doorway. He was tall, dressed in a simple, dark coat, but he filled the frame as if he were wearing armour. His hair was the colour of dark earth, his jaw sharp and clean. But it was his eyes that held me. They were a startling, stormy grey, and they were filled with a weariness that seemed too old for his face. He looked as if he'd practised being unbothered for years, and had suddenly forgotten all his lines. He looked from his mother to me, and a strange stillness fell over him. His lips parted slightly, as if to say a name, but no sound came out. His gaze locked on mine, and for a heart-stopping second I felt seen, not as Evelina Ward, the imposter, but as me, Eveline Wren, the girl in over her head. He didn't look at me with his mother's cold assessment. He looked at me with a shocking, painful recognition, as if he were seeing a ghost. The moment stretched, thick with unspoken questions. His mother's sharp voice finally sliced through the silence. "Calder, this is Miss Ward, my new companion." He didn't respond to her. He didn't take his eyes off my face. Behind me, from the shadows of the hallway, I heard a maid gasp. It was followed by a sharp, terrified whisper that was never meant for me to hear. But in the dead silence of that house, it was as loud as a scream. "Good heavens! She looks just like Lady Isabel." The whisper fell into the silence of the grand foyer, like a stone into a frozen lake. "Good heavens! She looks just like Lady Isabel." The world fractured. The maid who'd spoken clapped a hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with terror, and practically vanished into the shadows of the hallway. Mrs. Langston's elegant posture went rigid, her face hardening from cold marble into sharpened flint. But it was Calder's reaction that stole the breath from my lungs. He flinched, a barely perceptible tremor that ran through his entire body, as if the name itself were a physical blow. His stormy grey eyes, which had been fixed on me with that unnerving recognition, were suddenly shuttered, the connection severed as if a curtain had been dropped. The silence that followed was worse than the whisper. It was thick and heavy, filled with everything they refused to say. Lady Isabel. The name hung in the air, a ghost that had just been given form. My simple lie of impersonation had suddenly become something far more dangerous. I wasn't just a false companion. I was a doppelganger, a walking, breathing reminder of a woman who was clearly a wound in the heart of this house. Mrs. Langston was the first to move. She turned her head slowly, pinning me with a look of pure, venomous ice. "Riggs," she said, her voice dangerously soft, "show Miss Ward to her room." She's clearly overwhelmed by her journey. It was an order wrapped in a lie. I wasn't overwhelmed. I was terrified. And she wasn't concerned. She was dismissing the problem. She was putting the ghost back in its box. Calder said nothing. He didn't even look at me as I was led away. I could feel his gaze on my back, a burning, silent question I had no way of answering. The butler, Riggs, led me up the grand, curving staircase. Every step echoed. The portraits of stern-faced ancestors lining the walls seemed to watch my retreat, their painted eyes accusing me, imposter, fraud, sacrilege. The house was breathing now, and it had decided it didn't want me here. We walked down a long, draughty corridor, our footsteps the only sound. My room was at the far end of the west wing. It was a large, clean space, but it was profoundly lonely. A narrow bed, a sturdy wardrobe, a small writing desk, and a single armchair next to a window that overlooked a sad, neglected garden. It was a room for an employee, a space that offered function but no comfort. It was a clear, unspoken statement of my place in this house. I was not family. I was not a guest. I was a tool to be used. After Riggs left, closing the door with a quiet click, I sank onto the edge of the bed, my body trembling. Who was Lady Isabel? His wife? His sister? A fiancée? The way Mrs. Langston's face had tightened suggested a story that had ended badly. A previous guest, she had called her. It was a lie, I knew it instantly. You don't bar a house into silence for a mere guest. I went to the small washstand and looked at my reflection in the silvered mirror. For the first time in my life, I truly studied my own face. Not as Eveline Wren, but as a collection of features. Heart-shaped face, pale skin, dark hair that curled at the temples, eyes that were perhaps a little too wide, a little too watchful. Was this the face of a ghost? I tried to see what they saw, this uncanny resemblance that had thrown the entire household into a state of silent panic. But I saw nothing. I only saw a frightened girl who had made a catastrophic error in judgment. My face, the one thing I had ever truly owned, now felt like a borrowed mask. I had thought the letter was a key to a new life. What if it was a key to a cage? "Punctuality," Mrs. Langston had demanded. At 8:05, I stood outside the dining room, my hands clammy. I had changed into my only other dress, a simple navy blue wool that felt laughably inadequate in a house of such oppressive grandeur. My heart hammered against my ribs. This wasn't just dinner. It was an interrogation. The dining room was a cavern of mahogany and shadows. A fireplace large enough to stand in stood cold and empty at one end. A ridiculously long table, polished to a mirror shine, was set for 3. Mrs. Langston sat at the head, a queen on her throne. Calder sat to her right, staring down at his plate. I was directed to a seat on her left, so far from Calder that we might as well have been in different counties. Dinner was served by a silent, terrified maid, not the one from the hall. The meal was as cold and colourless as the atmosphere. Poached fish, boiled potatoes and flavourless greens. Dining with the Langstons wasn't a meal. It was a ceasefire. The only sounds were the scrape of a fork on a plate, the soft tread of the servant, and the ticking of that damned clock in the hall, counting down the seconds of my misery. Mrs. Langston finally broke the silence. "Tell me about your family, Miss Ward." Her voice was casual, but her eyes were sharp. It was the first question in her cross-examination. "They passed some years ago, madam," I said, sticking to the flimsy story I had concocted. "My father was a man of letters. He instilled in me a love for quiet pursuits." "How fortunate for you," she said, with no fortune in her tone at all. "And you have no other family? No siblings? No distant cousins who might wonder where you've gone?" She was probing for attachments, for people who might come looking for the real Evelina Ward. "No, madam. I am quite alone." The words were true, at least, and they had never sounded so bleak. She turned her cold gaze on her son. "Calder, you've been unusually quiet tonight." He looked up, his expression unreadable. "There hasn't been much to say, mother." "Nonsense! You could be welcoming Miss Ward to our home." The command was clear. Interact with the ghost. Let me watch you. Calder's eyes met mine across the vast expanse of polished wood. For a fleeting second, I saw the same turmoil from the foyer, a flicker of pained confusion. Then it was gone, replaced by a mask of polite indifference. "Welcome to Langston Hall, Miss Ward," he said, his voice a low, formal rumble. "I trust your room is satisfactory." "It is. Thank you, Mr. Langston." And that was it. The conversation died, strangled by the tension in the room. We ate in silence again. I could feel Mrs. Langston watching my every move, the way I held my fork, the way I sipped my water, the way I kept my eyes fixed on my plate. She was searching for a flaw, a crack in the facade of Evelina Ward. I felt like a butterfly pinned to a board, my wings slowly being torn away. She tried again, her voice like silk hiding steel. "Isabel, the young woman you resemble. She was fond of poetry. Do you read poetry, Miss Ward?" My blood ran cold. It was a direct test. She wanted to see me squirm. I took a slow breath, forcing my hands to remain steady in my lap. "I do, madam. Keats is a particular favourite." "Is he?" A cruel, faint smile touched her lips. She preferred Shelley. It was a dismissal of me, of my tastes, of my very existence. She was making it clear. You may have her face, but you are not her. You are nothing. I expected Calder to remain silent, to retreat back into his fortress of indifference. But he didn't. He set his fork down with a quiet, deliberate click. "Mother," he said, his voice low but firm, cutting through the oppressive atmosphere, "Miss Ward is not Lady Isabel. Perhaps we could afford her the courtesy of not being constantly compared to a memory." The world stopped. Mrs. Langston's head snapped toward him, her eyes blazing with a fury so potent it seemed to suck the warmth from the room. I stared at him, my heart doing a painful, hopeful flip in my chest. He had defended me. It was a small thing, a minor correction, but in the frozen landscape of Langston Hall, it felt like the first crack of a spring thaw. His gaze met mine again, and this time he didn't look away. In his eyes I saw an apology. For his mother. For the house. For the ghost of a woman I had never known. Mrs. Langston said nothing more for the rest of the meal. She had been challenged, and she did not like it. The air grew 10 degrees colder, the silence heavier, but something had shifted. A line had been drawn. When the miserable dinner was finally over, she rose. "I am retiring for the evening, Miss Ward. We will discuss your duties in the morning." She swept out of the room without another word to either of us. I stood, my legs unsteady, ready to flee back to the safety of my room. But as I entered the main hall, Calder's voice stopped me. "Miss Ward." I turned. He stood in the doorway of the dining room, framed by the dim light. He seemed hesitant, awkward, as if he regretted speaking at all. I apologize for my mother," he said, clearing his throat. "She is not always welcoming." "It's quite all right, Mr. Langston." "No, it's not." He took a step closer, and I had to fight the urge to step back. The air between us felt charged, humming with all the things we couldn't say. Langston Hall. It can take some getting used to. It was both a warning and an admission. I'm sure I'll manage, I said softly. He just nodded, his jaw tight. The man seemed to be built of rules and restraint, and I wondered what it would take to make him forget one. He looked like he wanted to say more, to ask the question that was screaming in the silence between us. Who are you? But he didn't. He just held my gaze for a moment longer, his eyes a storm of confusion and something else, something I was too afraid to name. Then he gave a stiff, formal nod and retreated back into the dining room. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding and turned, practically running for the stairs. I needed to get back to my room, to lock the door and just breathe. My corridor was long and dark, lit only by a single gas lamp at the far end that cast long, dancing shadows. As I walked, a draught of impossibly cold air washed over me. It was coming from a crossing corridor to my right, the east wing. The entire wing was dark, shrouded in a deeper blackness than the rest of the house. A thick rope of dust lay undisturbed on the floorboards. It was clearly unused, abandoned. My eyes were drawn to the end of the hall, where a single, imposing door stood. Unlike the other doors in the house, this one was different. A heavy, dark beam of wood had been set across it, bracketed into the wall on either side. It was barred shut, sealed. I stood there, a strange sense of dread and curiosity warring within me. Why would one room be locked up so completely? As I stared, my ears straining in the profound silence, I heard it. It was faint. So faint I thought I was imagining it at first. Delicate, tinny, and impossibly sad. It was the sound of a music box playing a gentle, broken lullaby from somewhere deep inside the sealed room. The melody was a ghost. It was so faint, a fragile thread of sound spun from silver and sorrow that it seemed to bypass my ears and prickle directly against my skin. For a full minute, I stood frozen in the dark, cold corridor, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. A music box, playing from a room that was not just locked, but physically barred from the outside world. The tune was a simple lullaby, but it was broken, stuttering in places as if the mechanism were old and tired. It played for less than a minute, then wound down into an unnerving silence. I didn't run. My feet were rooted to the spot, held there by a terror that was colder than the draught seeping from the east wing. My mind scrambled for a rational explanation. A trick of the wind. An echo from another part of the house. My own imagination. Frayed and overwrought from the strain of my deceit. But I knew, with a chilling certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I had not imagined it. I finally forced myself to move, backing away slowly, my eyes still fixed on the dark, barred door. I didn't turn my back on it until I was safely in the main hall. Then I fled up the stairs to my room and bolted the door behind me, a useless gesture in a house where the real dangers were already inside. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that sad, broken lullaby. I saw the dark beam across the door. I saw the look in Calder's eyes, that flash of pained recognition. Lady Isabel, a locked room, a music box. The pieces of a puzzle I never wanted to solve were being dropped into my lap, one by one. The house was trying to tell me its secrets, and I was terrified of what they might be. The next morning, Mrs. Langston summoned me to her private sitting room to outline my duties. The room was the only one I had seen so far that felt lived in, though it was still suffocatingly neat. She sat in a high-backed chair, her posture perfect, her hands folded over a leather-bound ledger. "Your duties are simple, Miss Ward," she began, her voice crisp. "You will read to me for 1 hour after breakfast. The papers first, then a chapter from a book of my choosing. You will accompany me on a walk through the gardens for 30 minutes before luncheon, weather permitting. In the evenings, you will provide quiet company here, in this room. You may bring needlepoint. You will not speak unless spoken to. Is that clear?" "Yes, madam," I said. It was the life of a well-kept doll. The routine she described left me with vast, empty chasms of time, hours in the afternoon with nothing to do. I soon realized this was by design. She did not want a friend or a confidant. She wanted a presence, a placeholder, something to fill the crushing silence of the house without disturbing it. This emptiness gave me the opportunity to do the one thing she would have forbidden, to watch. I became a student of Langston Hall's quiet misery. I watched the handful of servants move through the halls. They were a small, skeletal staff for a house this size, a clear sign of the fading fortune I'd begun to suspect. They moved with a practiced, fearful quiet, their eyes always downcast. They polished silver, swept floors, and carried laundry. But they moved with the constant, nervous energy of mice living in the shadow of a hawk. I learned that the East Wing was more than just unused. It was forbidden territory. The maids would clean right up to the edge of the crossing corridor and then stop, turning back as if they'd hit an invisible wall. They never spoke of it. They never spoke of Lady Isabel. Her name, once whispered, had been locked away again. One afternoon, I found a young maid named Clara dusting the portraits in the main hall. She was barely 18, with wide, frightened eyes and hands that trembled slightly. I thought she might be the easiest to talk to. "This is a vast house," I began, my voice casual. "It must take a great deal of work to keep it." She jumped, startled, and dropped her dust rag. "Oh, Miss Ward, Yes, miss, it does. I was exploring a little yesterday," I continued gently, bending to pick up the rag for her. "The West Wing is lovely, but the East Wing seems very quiet." The blood drained from Clara's face. She snatched the rag from my hand, her eyes darting down the hall, as if she expected Mrs. Langston to materialize from the shadows. "We don't go there, miss," she whispered, her voice shaking. "It's not for us." "Oh, is it unsafe?" I pressed, feigning innocence. It's closed." She wouldn't look at me. Since Lady Isabel passed, it was her wing, her ladyship's wing." My heart gave a painful thud. So she had been more than a guest, the wife, the fiancée, the lady of the house. "She must have been very loved," I murmured, watching the girl's face. Clara's expression was a mixture of sorrow and pure terror. "She was," she whispered. Then she shook her head, grabbing her bucket of supplies. "I have to work, miss. I can't be seen dawdling." She scurried away, leaving me alone with the silent, judging portraits. The confirmation only deepened my obsession. For 2 days, I fought the urge to go back, to stand before that sealed door again. I read the dreary financial papers to Mrs. Langston. I walked the sad, overgrown paths of the garden at her side. I sat in silence in the evenings, my needlepoint untouched in my lap. But all the while my mind was in the East Wing, listening for a melody that never came. On the 3rd day, I couldn't bear it any longer. In the deep quiet of the mid-afternoon, when I knew Mrs. Langston was taking her nap and the servants were busy in the kitchens, I slipped out of my room. The East Wing was even more unsettling in the daylight. Thin beams of grey light filtered through the grime-caked windows, illuminating swirling dust motes in the air. The furniture was draped in white sheets, ghostly lumps that looked like sleeping beasts in the gloom. A thick, undisturbed layer of dust covered the floor, so I had to walk on my very tiptoes to keep from leaving tracks. The air was frigid and smelled of dust and dried roses, the scent of a memory left to rot. There it was, the door. The heavy wooden beam across its middle looked ancient and immovable, like a permanent scar. The metal brackets holding it in place were rusted at the edges. This was not a temporary measure. This was a tomb. I reached out a trembling hand and touched the beam. The wood was rough and cold. I ran my fingers along its length, then touched the door itself. It was solid oak, cold as a headstone. I pressed my ear against it, holding my breath, straining to hear something, anything. Silence. Not even the whisper of a draught. Whatever was in that room was perfectly, unnaturally still. A floorboard creaked behind me. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. Calder stood at the entrance to the corridor watching me. He made no sound as he approached, his tall frame blocking the weak light, casting him in shadow. I couldn't read his expression, but I could feel the intensity of his gaze, a physical force that pinned me to the spot. My excuse died on my lips. There was no lie that would cover this. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes not on my face but on my hand, which was still pressed against the forbidden door. "What are you doing here?" he asked. His voice was quiet, dangerously so. It wasn't the anger I had expected. It was something far worse, a deep, hollow sorrow. I was just looking," I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. "The house is so large I must have lost my way." His gaze finally lifted to meet mine. "You are a terrible liar, Miss Ward." The accusation hung between us, sharp and undeniable. He knew, he didn't know everything, but he knew I was not what I seemed. He took a step closer, and my breath caught. He looked past me at the barred door, and for a single, unguarded moment, his mask of stoic control shattered. I saw it all. A wave of raw, unfiltered grief so profound it seemed to steal the air from the corridor. His jaw clenched, and his stormy eyes glistened with a pain so deep I felt an echo of it in my own chest. It was the look of a man staring at the grave of his entire world. Then, just as quickly, the mask was back in place. The shutters came down, and he was the master of Langston Hall once more. "You should not be here," he said, his voice low and strained. "What is this room?" I whispered, emboldened by the crack I'd seen in his armour. "Why is it sealed?" He looked at me, and the space between us vibrated with unspoken truths. I could see the battle raging within him, the duty to keep the silence versus an impulse he didn't understand. His hands were clenched into tight fists at his sides. "There are parts of this house that are best left alone," he said, his voice rough. "There are memories that are best left undisturbed. For your own safety, stay away from this wing." His eyes held mine, and the warning was clear. But beneath it, there was something else. Not a threat, but a plea. He was protecting the secret, yes, but I had the sudden, heart-stopping conviction that he was also trying to protect me. The air was thick with it, this fragile, terrifying connection that had been there since the moment he first saw me. It was a shared secret, even if I didn't know what it was yet. He didn't wait for my reply. He simply turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the dusty silence, leaving me alone with the barred door, the ghost of a lullaby, and leaving the final thought unfinished. The encounter in the East Wing left a fracture in the house's suffocating quiet. Something had been disturbed, and the silence that followed was different, heavier, charged with a new and volatile tension. Calder's warning, which was also a plea, echoed in my mind. For your own safety, stay away. He wasn't just protecting a family secret, he was protecting me from it. The thought was as terrifying as it was strangely comforting. After our confrontation, Calder became a ghost. He took his meals in his study, a place I was not permitted to go. I would see him sometimes from a distance, a tall, dark figure crossing the grounds, his shoulders set against the wind, but he never came near. The brief, fragile connection we'd shared in that dusty corridor was severed. He had retreated completely, leaving me alone with his mother and the house's oppressive secrets. Mrs. Langston seemed to sense the shift. A cruel, triumphant glint had appeared in her eyes. With Calder absent, I was hers to command entirely, a doll she could position as she pleased. Her favourite new pastime was to hold court in the grand drawing-room for afternoon tea, the one room that was kept meticulously clean. She would have a maid bring a silver tray with a porcelain tea set, and she would force me to sit opposite her for an hour that stretched into an eternity. It was during one of these torturous afternoons that she decided to unsheathe her claws. "You have your mother's eyes, Miss Ward," she said, her voice deceptively soft as she poured a stream of amber tea into a delicate cup. I'm not sure, madam." "I don't remember her well," I said, sticking to my thin backstory. "A shame." She placed the teapot down with a precise click. A daughter should know her own history. She looked directly at me, her gaze pinning me to my seat, just as a house should know its own ghosts. My blood ran cold. It was a direct, calculated strike. "Sit straighter, child," she commanded, her voice sharpening. "Your posture is unbecoming." I straightened my spine, my hands clenched in my lap. "Better," she mused, taking a slow sip of her tea. "Isabel always had perfect posture." She was trained from birth, of course, taught how to walk, how to sit, how to command a room with nothing more than a glance. She paused, her eyes raking over me with disdain. Some things cannot be learned, I suppose. They must be bred. Every word was a perfectly crafted insult, designed to remind me of my place. I was the imposter, the cheap imitation. I was not bred. I was common. I endured it in silence, my face a careful, neutral mask. I had learned that showing a reaction was giving her a victory, and I refused to give her the satisfaction. The daily ritual continued for a week, each tea time a new form of subtle torture. She would comment on my hair, my dress, my accent, always holding it up against the flawless memory of Lady Isabel. It was clear what she was doing. She was trying to break me. She wanted me to run. The more she spoke of this perfect phantom woman, the more I began to feel like a ghost myself, fading a little more each day. One afternoon, the assault took a different turn. "Calder has been avoiding us," she said, her voice laced with a bitter poison. "He buries himself in his father's books, as if the dead have better answers than the living." She looked at me, a cruel smile playing on her lips. "He does not like to be reminded of his failures." This was new. She had never spoken of Calder's role in the story before. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean, madam," I said, my voice carefully neutral. "Of course you don't," she scoffed. "You see a handsome, brooding man, heir to all of this." She made a sweeping gesture that encompassed the dusty, decaying grandeur of the room. "You don't see the guilt he carries. The guilt of a man who was not there when he was needed most." I said nothing, but my heart began to beat faster. This was a secret, being offered up like a poisoned confection. "Isabel's illness was sudden," Mrs. Langston continued, her eyes fixed on something far away, a memory she was polishing like a weapon. "She was prone to bouts of melancholy. Calder was in London on business. He was settling an investment, something he insisted could not wait. By the time we sent word, it was too late." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "He never forgave himself. He believes that if he had been here, he could have saved her. He could have lifted her from her sadness." She smiled, a truly chilling sight. "A man's guilt is a powerful chain, Miss Ward. My son has worn his for a very long time. She was telling me this for a reason. She was showing me the source of her power over him. She wasn't just his mother. She was the keeper of his shame, and she was warning me that I could never break that chain." As she spoke, her words painting a picture of a tragic, fragile woman and a guilt-ridden man, a small act of defiance sparked within me. I would not be her pawn, and I would not let her define the man who had, for a fleeting moment, tried to protect me. Just then, the doors to the drawing room swung open. Calder stood there. His face was pale, his jaw tight with a suppressed fury. It was obvious he had been standing outside, that he had heard everything. His stormy eyes met mine first, and in them I saw a flash of raw, profound humiliation. Then he turned his gaze on his mother. "That is enough," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. Mrs. Langston didn't flinch. She simply raised an eyebrow, the very picture of surprised innocence. "Calder, darling, you've decided to join us." "Do not speak of her again," he said, his voice low and shaking with rage. "Especially not to her." He gestured toward me, unable to say my name. He was including me in the circle of their grief, and it was a terrible, intimate thing. "I am merely making conversation with my companion," his mother replied coolly. "Is that forbidden now too?" "You are not making conversation," Calder shot back, taking a step into the room. You are opening wounds for sport. Leave Miss Ward out of your games." A tense, vibrating silence filled the room. It was the first time I had ever seen anyone stand up to her, and it was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. Mother and son were locked in a silent battle of wills, a war that had clearly been raging for years. Then Calder did something I never expected. He looked at me, his eyes softening with a flicker of apology and something else, a silent plea for me to be an ally. "Miss Ward has been working diligently, Mother," he said, his voice now calm and steady. "I was just coming to suggest that she might appreciate a walk. The grounds are stuffy, but the air by the old conservatory is fresh." He was offering me an escape. More than that, he was offering me his company. Mrs. Langston's face tightened. She had lost this round, and she knew it. "As you wish," she said, her voice dripping with ice. "Do not let me keep you from your duties." Calder's gaze held mine, a clear and silent instruction. "Come with me." My heart hammered against my ribs. I stood up, my legs feeling unsteady. "Thank you, Mr. Langston. I would like that very much." It was a declaration. I was choosing a side. I had come to this house as a liar and a coward, but in that moment, standing between the cold, manipulative matriarch and her tormented son, I finally found a sliver of courage. As I walked toward Calder, I felt Mrs. Langston's eyes on my back, cold and sharp as daggers. I knew I had just made a powerful and unforgiving enemy. But as Calder held the door open for me, and I stepped out of that suffocating room and into the hall beside him, I also felt something else. Something I hadn't felt since I'd first read that fateful letter. Hope. The walk to the conservatory was the longest of my life. Every step I took beside Calder Langston was a deliberate act of defiance against his mother. I could feel her fury burning into my back like a physical heat, a silent promise of retribution. We didn't speak. The corridor was filled only with the sound of our footsteps on the cold stone floor, his, a steady, measured tread, mine, a lighter, more hesitant echo. This silence was different from the crushing, empty void in the dining room. This was a silence that was full, humming with the words we couldn't say, with the risk we were both taking. I kept my eyes forward, my hands clasped so tightly my knuckles were white. What did he want? Why had he done that? My mind was a dizzying spiral of fear and a fragile, unfamiliar hope. I had come to this house to be invisible, to survive. But by defending me, he had made me seen, and I had no idea if that made me a target or an ally. He led me past the grand staircase and down a narrow, less-travelled hall. The air grew cooler, the portraits on the walls replaced by faded botanical prints. At the very end of the corridor was a heavy door of wood and glass. Condensation misted the panes, obscuring the view within. He pushed it open, and the air that washed over me was a revelation. It was warm. Not the dry, oppressive heat of a fireplace, but a living warmth, thick with the smell of damp earth, wet leaves, and the sweet, heavy perfume of flowers blooming out of season. After the cold, dead stillness of the house, stepping into the conservatory was like stepping into another world. It was a cathedral of glass and iron, its arched ceiling soaring 3 stories high. Sunlight, pale and wintry, streamed through the panes, illuminating a chaotic jungle of green. Palms brushed against the glass, ferns unfurled in shaded corners, and vines thick with blossoms I couldn't name twisted around the iron framework. It was beautiful, but like the rest of the hall, it was touched by a gentle neglect. There were overgrown paths, fallen leaves, and a sense of wildness reclaiming a once-ordered space. Calder seemed to breathe differently in here. The rigid set of his shoulders eased, and the harsh lines around his mouth softened. This was a sanctuary. "My father built this," he said, his voice quiet, stripped of the formal edge it held in the house. He was looking up at the glass ceiling, not at me. He believed a man should be able to feel the sun on his face, even in the depths of a Berkshire winter. The words were simple, but they were the first truly personal thing he had ever said to me. He was sharing a piece of his past, a memory untainted by his mother's poison. "It's beautiful," I said, and for the first time, I wasn't measuring my words. I was just speaking the truth. He finally looked at me. A flicker of something. Gratitude. Surprise. In his stormy eyes before he turned and started down a narrow, moss-lined path. I followed. Walking beside him now felt less dangerous, more natural. The plants gave us something else to look at, a neutral ground where we could exist without the constant, crushing weight of what we were, master and companion, deceiver and deceived. "He was a patient man," Calder continued, his voice a low rumble. He stopped before a strange, delicate plant with a single star-shaped white bloom. "This is a ghost orchid. My father imported it from the Americas. It took him nearly a decade to get it to bloom. He said it was a lesson in waiting for something that might never come." He was talking about a flower, but his words hung in the warm, humid air with a much heavier meaning. He was a man trapped, waiting for something that might never come. Freedom, peace, forgiveness. "Did he get to see it bloom often?" I asked softly. A sad, faint smile touched Calder's lips. It was a startling sight, like seeing a crack of light in a stone wall. "Once, the year before he died." My heart ached for him, for the boy who had lost a patient, kind father and been left with a cold, calculating mother. I saw in that moment the source of his endless restraint. He was the product of two opposing forces, a man caught between the sun and the ice. "It's a beautiful legacy to leave behind," I said. He reached out, his long fingers gently touching one of the flower's pristine white petals. The gesture was so tender, so at odds with the harsh discipline he usually projected. He tried to teach me about them. The Latin names, the soil compositions. He shook his head slightly. I was too busy learning about ledgers and shipping manifests. The regret in his voice was a raw, open thing. He was showing me a glimpse of the man he might have been, had his life not been derailed by duty and grief. He turned from the orchid, his arm brushing against mine as he moved. The touch was nothing, a whisper of wool against wool, but a jolt of pure electric heat shot through me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. He stopped, his body held perfectly still. He was so close I could feel the warmth radiating from him, could see the flecks of grey in his dark eyes. The air grew thick, heavy. The sounds of the conservatory, the drip of water from a leaf, the hum of a trapped insect, faded into a dull roar in my ears. The polite distance between us had vanished, and in its place was a dangerous magnetic pull that I had no power to resist. His gaze dropped to my lips for a fraction of a second, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. Then the moment broke. He took a sharp step back, the mask of cool indifference slamming back into place. His jaw was tight, his fists clenched at his sides. "My apologies," he said, his voice stiff and formal once more. "There's no need," I whispered, my voice unsteady. An awkward, charged silence descended. He had retreated back into his fortress, but I had seen inside. I knew now that his restraint wasn't born of indifference. It was a cage he had built around a heart that felt far too much. "I should let you get back to your duties," he said, the words clipped. It was a dismissal, a return to our proper roles. "Of course," I replied, my own voice a hollow echo. He led the way out, his back straight and rigid, but as we reached the door to leave the warmth of the conservatory and re-enter the cold silence of the house, he paused and looked back at me. His gaze held mine, and in the quiet space of that look a silent understanding passed between us. We had created a truce, a small, fragile alliance in the heart of his family's war. We had found a sanctuary, and now we both knew we had something to lose. At dinner that evening, I did not dare look at Calder, and he did not look at me. Yet I was aware of him in a way I had never been before. The space he occupied, the quiet rhythm of his breathing, the way he paused for a fraction of a second before answering one of his mother's pointed questions. When the salt cellar was placed just out of my reach, he slid it silently across the polished table. Our fingers brushed for a moment, a spark of warmth in the chilling silence. I pulled my hand back as if burned, and from the corner of my eye, I saw his jaw tighten. Mrs. Langston glanced up from her plate, her gaze sweeping over us with suspicion. In an instant, Calder was the same distant, stoic man he had been before, his expression a mask of indifference. But I knew. We both knew. The air was thick with the secret we were keeping, a thin sheet of glass that felt as if it might shatter with a single wrong word. The hope that had taken root in the warmth of the conservatory was a dangerous, thorny bloom. It made me brave. My passive curiosity, born of fear and self-preservation, sharpened into an active, urgent need for answers. I needed to understand the ghost whose face I apparently wore, not just to protect myself, but to understand the deep well of pain in Calder's eyes. His grief was a puzzle, and I felt, with a certainty that defied all logic, that some crucial piece of it was missing. My opportunity came on a relentlessly grey afternoon. Mrs. Langston, complaining of a headache, had retired to her room, leaving me with a yawning chasm of unsupervised time. My first thought was of the library. It was Calder's father's domain, a room that felt insulated from the rest of the house's oppressive atmosphere. It was a place of knowledge, of history. It was the perfect place to hide, and the perfect place to search. With the excuse of finding a new book for my reading duties, I slipped inside. The library was just as I had imagined it, a quiet haven of dark wood and the comforting, dusty scent of old paper and leather. Sunlight struggled through the tall, arched windows, illuminating the spines of 1,000 silent stories. Unlike the rest of the house, which felt frozen in time, the library felt timeless, a sanctuary of thought where the house's ghosts might be less restless. I ran my fingers over the leather-bound volumes, my gaze scanning the titles. I didn't know what I was looking for. A diary? A forgotten journal? I drifted towards the poetry section, my mind snagging on a memory. She preferred Shelley, Mrs. Langston had said with such disdain. It was a long shot, a foolish whim, but it was the only lead I had. I found the volumes easily, a handsome set bound in deep blue leather. I pulled one out, the complete works of Percy Bysshe Shelley. The book felt heavy in my hands, a vessel of someone else's memories. I opened it, the pages whispering as they parted. And there, tucked between a poem about a skylark and one about the wind, was a small, folded piece of cream-coloured paper. It was a fragment of a letter, the bottom half torn away raggedly. The handwriting was elegant, slanted and unmistakably feminine. My heart began to beat a frantic, suffocating rhythm. With trembling fingers, I unfolded it and read the words written in faded ink. He insists it is for my own good, but I see the way he looks at me. It is not with love, but with impatience. He speaks of my melancholy, but it is his presence that smothers me. This fortune my father left me was meant to be a gift, but in his hands it has become a cage, and I fear he means to lock the door permanently. I must make someone understand. I am not sick, I tell you. I am a prisoner, and I am running out of... The letter ended there, torn away at the most crucial moment. I read it again, the words burning themselves into my mind. This fortune. A cage. He means to lock the door permanently. I am not sick. I am a prisoner. This was not the story Mrs. Langston had told. This was not a fragile woman succumbing to sadness. This was a woman in fear for her life. And who was he? The word leaped off the page, a silent accusation. My first thought, cold and sickening, was of Calder. Had his impatience to take control of her fortune driven him to... No. I pushed the thought away. The man I had seen in the conservatory, the man who tended a delicate orchid because it reminded him of his father, could not be the man in this letter. Could he? Finding anything of interest, Miss Ward? The voice came from the doorway, low and unexpected. I gasped, spinning around, my hand instinctively crushing the fragile paper in my fist. Calder stood there, watching me. His face was a mask of neutrality, but his eyes missed nothing. They flicked from my face to my clenched fist and back again. The silence stretched, thick with my guilt. "A new book for my mother," I stammered, the lie sounding pathetic even to my own ears. He took a slow step into the room, his gaze never leaving mine. "You are hiding something." It wasn't a question. He walked towards me, his presence filling the quiet room, making it feel small and airless. He stopped directly in front of me and held out his hand, palm up. "Show me." My mind raced. To deny it was pointless. To run was impossible. My heart hammered against my ribs, a trapped bird. Slowly, shamefully, I unfurled my fingers and placed the crumpled piece of paper in his outstretched hand. His skin was warm, and the brief contact sent a shock up my arm. He took the note without a word and unfolded it. I watched his face as he read, searching for any sign of guilt, of recognition. I saw none. Instead, I saw the blood drain from his cheeks, replaced by a pale, shocked horror. The stoic mask he wore so perfectly didn't just crack, it shattered. He looked from the letter to me, his stormy eyes wide with a dawning, terrible understanding. This was not his secret. He was reading these words for the first time, just as I had. "Where?" he said, his voice a rough, strangled whisper. "Where did you find this?" "In the book," I breathed, pointing a trembling finger at the volume of Shelley still open on the table. He looked at the book, then back at the letter, the pieces of a puzzle clicking into place in his mind, forming a picture he had never wanted to see. The story of Isabel's tragic decline, the story he had built his guilt upon for years, had just been revealed as a lie. He didn't get angry. He didn't accuse me. He just stood there, looking utterly lost, the foundations of his world crumbling around him. He carefully refolded the piece of paper, his movements precise and deliberate, as if the small act of folding could contain the chaos the words had unleashed. He slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat, a secret now pressed close to his heart. He looked at me then, and the dynamic between us shifted forever. I was no longer just the woman who wore a ghost's face. I was now the sole witness to his discovery, the only other person in the world who knew the truth contained in that torn piece of paper. "Say nothing of this to anyone," he said, his voice low and firm, his composure returning like a shield rising into place. "Especially not to my mother." He had just bound me to him with the most dangerous secret of all. I wasn't an imposter anymore. I was an accomplice. He turned without another word, and left the library, leaving me alone in the deafening silence, the weight of Lady Isabel's last desperate words settling over us both. The secret of the letter lay between us like a chasm. In the days that followed our discovery in the library, Calder and I spoke less than ever, yet we were bound more tightly than if we had spent hours in conversation. We were partners in a truth we couldn't share, and the weight of it forced us apart. At dinner, we became masters of avoidance, our eyes meeting only in brief, flickering glances that were heavy with unspoken questions. He retreated once more into his study, and I into my role as Mrs. Langston's silent shadow. But this new silence was different. Before, it had been a space of uncertainty. Now, it was a space of shared knowledge, a dangerous ground where we both stood, waiting. The words from the letter haunted me. I am a prisoner. The fear in them was a living thing, a cold dread that seeped into the very walls of the hall. The he in the letter could have been anyone, but the list of suspects was terrifyingly small. My brief, sickening suspicion of Calder had faded, replaced by the memory of the genuine shock on his face. He was not the author of Isabel's fear, but that left a far more chilling possibility, one that hovered at the edge of my thoughts, a spectre I was too afraid to name. I knew I couldn't learn more from Calder. He was wrestling with his own demons, re-evaluating every memory he had of the woman he was supposed to marry. If I wanted to find the truth, I had to look elsewhere. I had to look to the silent, watchful staff who saw everything. My thoughts turned to Clara, the young maid with the perpetually frightened eyes. Fear like hers wasn't just born of a harsh employer. It was born of a terrible knowledge. I knew I couldn't approach her directly. An interrogation, no matter how gentle, would only send her scurrying into silence. I had to earn her trust. My chance came, 2 afternoons later. I was walking down a service corridor when I saw her struggling to haul a massive wicker basket of linens up a narrow flight of stairs. She was small, and the basket was nearly as big as she was, its weight causing her to tremble with exertion. Her face was pale and beaded with sweat. Looking quickly down the hall to ensure we were alone, I hurried to her side. "Here," I said softly. "Let me help you with that." Clara jumped, a small frightened gasp escaping her lips. Her eyes were wide with panic. "Oh no, miss. You mustn't. If Mrs. Langston were to see—" "She is not here," I said, my voice calm and firm. I took one side of the heavy basket, and my mother always used to say that many hands make light work. It would be foolish for me to watch you struggle. She stared at me, her mouth slightly agape. A companion, a woman from upstairs, offering to help with a servant's chore was unheard of. It was a breach of the rigid class structure that governed our lives. But I held her gaze, offering a small, reassuring smile. Hesitantly she nodded, and together we carried the basket up the stairs. It was still heavy, but the load was shared. When we reached the top, she couldn't meet my eyes, her cheeks flushed with a mixture of gratitude and confusion. "Thank you, miss," she whispered to the floorboards. "It was nothing, Clara," I said. "We all must help one another in this house." I left her then, knowing I had planted a small seed of trust. I could only hope that it would be enough. That evening, after another tense, silent dinner, I was making my way back to my room when I heard a faint sound from a small alcove where clean linens were stored. It was the sound of someone trying and failing to stifle a sob. I peeked inside. It was Clara, huddled on a small stool, her face buried in her apron, her small shoulders shaking. My heart went out to her. I slipped into the alcove, the scent of lavender and starch filling the small space. I didn't speak. I simply sat on a stack of folded sheets beside her and offered her my handkerchief. She took it, her hand trembling. For a long time, she just cried, and I just sat, a silent witness to her sorrow. The simple act of companionship, of being present in her grief without demanding an explanation, seemed to undo something within her. "It's my sister's birthday tomorrow," she finally whispered, her voice thick with tears. "Rose. She would have been 20. "Rose," I repeated softly. "That's a lovely name." Her face crumpled again. "She worked here too," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush, as if a dam had broken. "She was a lady's maid." "To Lady Isabel." My breath caught in my chest, but I remained perfectly still, forcing myself to just listen. "They were close," Clara continued, twisting my handkerchief in her hands. "Lady Isabel. She wasn't like Mrs. Langston. She was kind. She would talk to Rose for hours, tell her things. Rose said she was unhappy, frightened. This confirmed everything the letter had hinted at. Frightened of what? I asked gently. Clara shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know." Rose wouldn't say, but the week her ladyship died, Rose vanished. The air in the small closet grew cold, heavy. Vanished. "Mrs. Langston told us she'd run off with a boy from the village," Clara sobbed. "She said Rose stole a silver locket to pay her way. But it's a lie, miss. I know it is. Rose would never steal, and she would never ever have left without saying goodbye to me. We were all each other had." The final, terrible piece of the story settled into place. A dead heiress. A vanished maid. "Clara," I said, my own voice trembling slightly. "Why hasn't anyone gone to the constable?" She looked at me, her eyes filled with a fear so profound it made my blood run cold. "You don't understand, miss. Mrs. Langston holds our lives in her hands. My mother still works in the village. If I were to cause trouble, she could have my whole family turned out, with no references, no way to find work. We would starve. We all know to keep quiet. That's the first rule of Langston Hall. I comforted her as best I could, making her promise to speak to me if she remembered anything else. I left her in the linen closet and walked back to my room in a daze. This was no longer just a story of deceit and a stolen inheritance. This was about a missing girl, a potential second victim whose life and disappearance had been cruelly erased. The secrets of this house weren't just about preserving a family's pride. They were about concealing a crime, possibly murder. I sat on the edge of my bed, the weight of it all pressing down on me, threatening to suffocate me. I was in deeper than I had ever imagined. A soft, hesitant knock sounded at my door. My heart leaped into my throat. It was late, well past the hour that anyone should be walking the halls. I stood, my legs unsteady, and opened the door a crack. Calder stood there. His face was grim, his eyes dark with a new urgent intensity. He had been in his study for days, wrestling with the words in the letter. It was clear he had reached a conclusion. "We need to talk," he said, his voice a low, urgent whisper. "Not here." Calder stood in the shadows of the corridor, a tall, grim silhouette against the flickering gaslight. The urgency in his low voice sent a tremor of fear and anticipation through me. "We need to talk. Not here." This was it. The secret we shared was no longer a passive burden. It was about to become an active conspiracy. "Where?" I whispered, my heart hammering against my ribs. "The conservatory," he said, his eyes darting down the empty hall. "Wait 10 minutes. Make sure no one is about." He turned and was gone, his footsteps silent as a ghost's. I closed my door, my back pressing against the cool wood, and took a deep, shaky breath. For days, we had been 2 islands, separated by a sea of unspoken fear. Now he was building a bridge. To step onto it was to leave the relative safety of my isolation, to bind my fate to his completely. There was no question of turning back. I was already in too deep. The 10 minutes I waited were the longest of my life. Every creak of the old house, every sigh of the wind outside my window sounded like an approaching footstep. Finally, I slipped out of my room. The house was transformed at night, a labyrinth of ink-black shadows and pale moonlight. The grand foyer was a cavern of ghosts, the stern portraits of the Langston ancestors watching my passage with hollow eyes. I moved on silent feet, a thief in the night, my only purpose to reach the sanctuary Calder had offered. The glass door to the conservatory was cold under my hand. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The air was warm and thick, smelling of night-blooming jasmine and damp earth. The space was utterly magical in the dark. Moonlight streamed through the high glass panes, bathing the leaves in a ghostly silver light and casting intricate shifting patterns on the stone floor. It was a secret world, hidden away from the cold, dreaming house. He was waiting for me by the ghost orchid, his form a dark shape among the silvered leaves. He turned as I approached, and in the pale light I could see that the stoic mask was gone. His face was etched with a profound, weary anxiety. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice a low whisper that was quickly swallowed by the vast, quiet space. "You said you discovered something," I prompted, my own voice hushed. "I did." He ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture of pure exhaustion. "After you showed me the letter, I started looking through my father's old estate records. Financial ledgers, legal documents, things I've managed for years but never truly looked at." He paused, his gaze finding mine in the darkness. Isabel's inheritance was structured in a peculiar way. Her father was a wealthy industrialist. He left her a fortune, large enough to make her completely independent. He took a step closer, the urgency in his voice growing. But there was a clause in the trust, a very specific clause. If she were to die unmarried and without issue, a substantial portion of that fortune, a sum large enough to save this estate 10 times over, was to be redirected. It would go into a stewardship fund for the preservation of Langston Hall. My blood ran cold as I understood the implication. "A fund that you would control?" "No," he said, and the word was filled with a dawning horror. "A fund to be managed solely by the current matriarch of the estate. It would have been controlled in its entirety by my mother. The secret hung in the air between us, ugly and undeniable. Motive. It was the one piece that had been missing. The cold, hard reason for everything. Mrs. Langston hadn't just disliked Isabel. She had stood to gain a fortune from her death. The image of her, coolly pouring tea while she dissected my character, took on a new, monstrous dimension. "Calder," I said, my voice barely audible. "There's more." He looked at me, his face a grim mask of expectation. He knew there was a reason I had been in the library, a reason I had been searching. I took a deep breath and told him everything. I told him about Clara, about her sister Rose, who had been Isabel's maid, her confidant. I told him how Rose had vanished without a trace the very same week that Isabel had died, and how his mother had concocted a story about theft and a runaway lover to cover the girl's disappearance. As I spoke, I watched the last vestiges of denial crumble within him. He had lived under the weight of his guilt for so long, believing he had failed Isabel in her time of need. But now, a new, more terrible truth was taking its place. This wasn't a tragedy of melancholy and neglect. This was a conspiracy of greed and, very possibly, murder. Isabel hadn't been sick. She had been silenced. And Rose, who knew her secrets, had likely been silenced with her. "I believed her," he whispered, his voice hoarse with self-recrimination. "I remember when Rose left. My mother was so convincing. I never questioned it." He looked at me, his eyes filled with a storm of guilt and a rising cold fury. "For years, I have let my guilt blind me. I have let her control me with it. And all the while, she was the one." We stood in silence for a long moment, the weight of our combined knowledge settling over us. We had a letter fragment hinting at imprisonment, a legal document providing a motive, and a servant's testimony about a second potential victim. It was a horrific story, but it was all circumstantial. We had no proof. "What do we do?" I asked, the question a plea. Calder's expression hardened, his sorrow solidifying into a new, sharp-edged resolve. The haunted, grieving man was gone, replaced by someone I had not seen before, the true master of Langston Hall, ready to fight for its soul. "She wouldn't have been careless," he said, thinking aloud. "Whatever she did, she would have covered her tracks. But Isabel knew she was in danger. She was trying to tell someone. She would have left something behind, proof." "But where?" I asked. "A diary. More letters." He looked past me, his gaze fixed on the dark, looming shape of the main house visible through the glass. "There is only one place she would have felt safe enough to hide something," he said, his voice low and determined. "In her own rooms. In the east wing. The sealed room. The barred door. The heart of the entire mystery." "But it's locked," I said. "Barred from the outside. We can't get in." "The bar is just a deterrent," he said, turning back to me, his eyes now blazing with a fierce, dangerous light. "A theatrical gesture. The door is still locked with a key, and my mother is the only one who has it." He took a step closer, and the space between us felt electric, charged with the gravity of our new purpose. "She keeps it on her person at all times, on a chatelaine she wears at her waist. We have to get it from her." The impossible, terrifying task hung in the air between us. Steal the key from the woman who controlled every shadow in this house, a woman who may very well be a murderer. It was a fool's errand, destined to fail. But as I looked at the grim determination on Calder's face, I knew we had no other choice. Our midnight truce was sealed. We were no longer just sharing a secret. We were embarking on a mission. The announcement came 2 days after our midnight meeting, delivered by Mrs. Langston at the breakfast table with the air of a queen issuing a royal decree. "We will be hosting the annual Langston Winter Masquerade on Saturday next," she stated, her eyes on Calder. "It is a tradition my late husband insisted upon, and it is a necessary evil to maintain our standing in the county." My stomach turned to ice. A party. A house full of strangers who would stare and whisper, who might have known the real Evelina Ward, or worse, known Lady Isabel. It was a nightmare. A public stage where my every word and gesture would be scrutinized. I wanted to refuse, to feign illness, to simply vanish. But then I saw Calder's eyes meet mine across the table. In them, I saw not dread, but a flicker of grim opportunity. The masquerade was not a threat. It was a chance. He found me later that day in the hall, under the guise of discussing the guest list. As soon as we were alone, his voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "This is it," he said. "It's our only chance. The house will be full. She will be distracted by her duties as hostess. I'll create a diversion. That's when you'll have to get close to her." "And do what?" I breathed, though I already knew the answer. "The key," he said, his jaw tight. "She will be wearing it on her chatelaine. When I give the signal, you have to try and take it." The audacity of the plan stole the air from my lungs. To attempt to pick the pocket of the formidable Mrs. Langston in a room full of Berkshire's high society was not just risky. It was madness. We were no longer just searching for the truth. We were becoming criminals to find it. The night of the ball arrived with the bitter cold of a gathering storm. Mrs. Langston had a dress laid out for me, a gown of deep emerald silk that was far too fine for a paid companion. As the maid, Clara, helped me into it, she let out a small, trembling gasp. "This was her ladyship's," she whispered, her fingers tracing the delicate silver embroidery at the neckline. Mrs. Langston had claimed it was altered. A convenient lie. She was not just dressing me. She was costuming me. She was intentionally parading me in front of her guests as a ghost. A cruel, psychological game that made my skin crawl. The final touch was a simple silver mask that covered my eyes. A flimsy shield that I knew would do nothing to hide the resemblance that had started this whole nightmare. Dressed in a dead woman's clothes, I felt like a sacrificial lamb being led to slaughter. The ballroom, a cavernous space I had only ever seen draped in dust sheets, was transformed. Hundreds of candles blazed in crystal chandeliers, their light glinting off the masks and jewels of the anonymous guests. A string quartet played a sweeping waltz, the music weaving through the intoxicating scent of champagne and expensive perfume. It was a breathtaking, beautiful lie, a glittering facade hiding the house's dark, rotting core. I entered the room, and a hush fell over the small group by the door. I could feel their eyes on me, hear the whispers bloom in my wake. "Uncanny. Is that the new companion? Looks just like—" I kept my head high, my gloved hands clasped in front of me, and walked towards the shadows at the edge of the room. A tall figure detached himself from the crowd and moved towards me. He was wearing a simple black mask, but I knew the set of his shoulders, the confident grace of his walk. It was Calder. "Miss Ward," he said, his voice a low, formal rumble for the benefit of anyone listening. He bowed. "May I have this dance?" I placed my trembling hand in his, and he led me onto the floor. He pulled me into the rhythm of the waltz, his hand firm on my back. For the first time, we were close, our bodies moving as one, surrounded by 100 strangers, yet utterly alone in our own small world. "You look terrified," he murmured, his lips close to my ear, his breath warm against my skin. "I am," I confessed. "This dress, it was hers, wasn't it?" His hand tightened on my back. It was. "My mother's cruelty knows no bounds. I am sorry." "Don't be," I whispered, looking up at him. Behind the mask, his eyes were dark and intense. "Tonight, we use her cruelty against her." We danced in silence for a moment, the danger of our mission and the thrill of his closeness swirling together into a heady, intoxicating mix. Under the anonymity of our masks, we were not master and companion. We were just a man and a woman bound by a secret, dancing on the edge of a knife. "When you see me approach Lord Ashworth by the fireplace, that will be the signal," he said, his voice low. "He loves to argue politics. It will be loud enough to draw her attention. You will have a minute, no more." The music came to an end. He squeezed my hand once, a silent gesture of solidarity, then released me and melted back into the crowd. I watched him go, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm. My part was about to begin. I saw him move towards the fireplace, intercepting a portly, red-faced man, Lord Ashworth. As Calder began to speak, their voices grew louder, more animated. Just as he'd predicted, a small crowd began to gather, intrigued by the debate. Mrs. Langston, ever the perfect hostess, turned towards the commotion, her back to me, for the first time all evening. This was my chance. My blood roared in my ears as I moved through the crowd, my eyes fixed on the silver chatelaine at her waist. I could see it clearly, a cluster of small, ornate keys, one of them a darker, older iron than the others. That had to be it. I was 3 feet away. 2. My hand was damp with sweat inside my glove. I lifted my arm, pretending to adjust the back of my gown, my fingers outstretched, trembling. "Isabel, my dear girl." A hand clamped down on my arm, stopping me cold. I looked up into the wine-flushed face of an elderly man with a kind, watery smile. He was a stranger to me. "I knew you'd come back," he said, his voice a loud, slurring whisper. "Never believed that nonsense for a second. The Langston pride is a powerful thing, but it couldn't keep you away forever." He was holding my arm, pulling me away from Mrs. Langston, his voice carrying across the sudden lull in the crowd. The diversion was over. The argument had stopped. Everyone was staring. My mission had failed. Across the room, I saw Calder's face, pale with shock. But worst of all was Mrs. Langston. She had turned, her eyes 2 chips of ice, and they were locked onto me, with an expression of pure, murderous fury. I tried to pull away from the old man, but he held my arm tight, leaning in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that only I could hear. "I have your letter, my dear," he breathed, his breath smelling of brandy. "The one you sent me the day before you fell ill. The one begging for my help. I kept it, just as you asked." The old man's words were a brand, searing themselves into my mind. "I have your letter." For a frozen moment, the entire ballroom seemed to vanish, leaving only his brandy-laced whisper and the furious, ice-cold stare of Mrs. Langston from across the room. My attempt to steal her key had failed, but I had stumbled upon something infinitely more valuable, a piece of Isabel's story that had escaped the walls of Langston Hall. The spell was broken by Calder. He materialized at my side, his presence a sudden solid shield. With a disarming smile that did not reach his eyes, he placed a firm hand on the old man's arm. "Lord Pembroke," he said, his voice dangerously smooth, "the hour grows late, and the champagne has clearly been too kind to you. Allow me to have a driver see you home." He skillfully and swiftly extracted me from the man's grasp and, with a nod to a footman, had Lord Pembroke escorted from the room before another word could be said. The incident shattered the party's glittering facade. A strange, tense silence fell over the remaining guests, and within a quarter of an hour, the ballroom was empty. The candles guttered in their sconces, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to mock the night's failed ambitions. Mrs. Langston said nothing to me. As the last guest departed, she simply turned and ascended the grand staircase without a single backward glance. Her silence was a promise of retribution, far more terrifying than any tirade could have been. I fled to my room, my mind reeling. The mission had been a catastrophic failure, exposing me to my enemy's full wrath. Yet it had also given us a name, a lead, a hope. Lord Pembroke. He had the proof we needed. But as I lay in my bed, sleep 1,000 miles away, I knew that Mrs. Langston would not allow me to live long enough to find it. The next morning, the house was unnervingly still, as if holding its breath. Calder was gone, having ridden out at dawn to attend to some urgent, and likely fabricated, estate business. I knew he was giving his mother a wide berth, allowing her fury to cool. It left me alone a mouse in a house with a very patient cat. Just before noon, the summons came. Riggs, the butler, appeared at my door. "Mrs. Langston requests your presence for tea in the drawing-room, miss." My blood ran cold. It was a return to her old ritual of psychological torture, but I knew, after last night, that the game had changed. This would not be an interrogation of words, but something far worse. I had no choice but to obey. I found her seated by the fire, the silver tea service gleaming on the table beside her. She was the picture of calm, aristocratic elegance, her posture perfect, her face a serene, unreadable mask. The contrast with the cold fury I had seen in her eyes last night was deeply unsettling. "Miss Ward," she said, her voice as smooth as cream, "do sit down." I was just thinking what a resounding success the ball was, don't you agree? "It was a lovely evening, madam," I said, my voice a dry whisper. "Indeed." She picked up the porcelain teapot, its delicate floral pattern a mockery of the poison I felt emanating from her. "It is so important to remind people of who we are. Some people in their ambition can forget their place. It is a hostess's duty to gently but firmly remind them." Her eyes met mine as she poured the tea. They were as cold and empty as a winter sky. "I have had cook prepare a special blend for you this morning. A tonic, to soothe the nerves. I imagine yours must be quite frayed after such an eventful evening." She held the cup and saucer out to me. To refuse would be an open declaration of war, an accusation I could not prove. My hand trembled as I took it from her. The warmth of the porcelain felt sickening against my skin. Trapped, I lifted the cup to my lips and drank, forcing myself to swallow the hot, bitter liquid. It had a strange, metallic aftertaste that coated my tongue. "There now," Mrs. Langston said, a faint, chilling smile touching her lips. "That's better, isn't it?" I returned to my room, my heart a frantic trapped bird in my chest. For a while, nothing happened. I sat on my bed, trying to rationalize, trying to convince myself that my fear was making me imagine things. Perhaps it was just a strange blend of tea. Perhaps it was all in my mind. Then, the room began to tilt. A wave of dizziness washed over me, so potent I had to grip the bedpost to keep from falling. A cold sweat broke out across my brow, and the edges of my vision began to blur, darkening as if a curtain were being drawn. A heavy, creeping lethargy was taking root in my limbs, my body feeling like lead. It was a fog, rolling through my mind, stealing my thoughts, stealing my strength. My God, it was happening. The sudden illness, the melancholy. This is how she had done it. This is what Isabel must have felt. Not a swift, merciful poison, but a slow, cruel descent into helplessness. I had to get help. I pushed myself off the bed, my legs buckling beneath me. I fell to my knees, crawling towards the door, my breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. A crushing weight was settling on my chest. I reached the door, my fingers fumbling uselessly for the handle, but I had no strength left to turn it, no air left to call out. My vision narrowed to a single, dark point. My last conscious thought was of Calder, of the letter we hadn't found, of the truth that was about to die with me. Then, the darkness swallowed me whole. A distant, echoing sound. Banging, shouting. My name. Being called from a great distance. The door to my room burst open. A figure of light and shadow stood there. Calder. He must have seen me, a crumpled heap on the floor. He was at my side in an instant, his hands cool on my feverish skin. "Eveline," he said, his voice raw with a panic that cut through my delirium. He was using my real name. "Eveline, look at me." I couldn't. My eyes wouldn't focus. He saw the teacup overturned on the table beside my bed. His head snapped up, and a look of pure, murderous rage contorted his features. The love, the grief, the years of repressed anger, it all ignited in his eyes at once. The pretense of master and companion, of duty and restraint was burned away in that single, horrifying moment of understanding. He was no longer the stoic heir of Langston Hall. He was a man watching the woman he was falling in love with die in the exact same way as the woman he had failed to save years ago. He scooped me up into his arms, my head lolling against his shoulder. He held me as if I were the most precious thing in the world, his movements no longer hesitant or awkward, but filled with a fierce, desperate certainty. He carried me out of the room and into the hall, shouting, his voice a roar that shattered the house's cold, suffocating silence. "Riggs! Clara! Fetch a doctor! Now!" The war for Langston Hall was no longer a quiet affair fought in whispers and shadows. It had just become brutally, violently open. I surfaced from the darkness slowly, as if rising from the bottom of a deep, cold lake. Consciousness came in fragmented waves, broken images and muted sounds that made no sense. I was aware of a profound sense of warmth, of a softness beneath me that was unfamiliar. I saw the concerned, bearded face of a man I didn't know, his spectacles glinting in the lamplight. I heard the sound of weeping and saw Clara's tear-streaked face. And through it all, there was a constant, steady presence, a dark shape in a chair by the bed, a cool hand on my forehead, a low, murmuring voice that was the only anchor in the swirling chaos of my mind. It was Calder. When I finally opened my eyes with a clarity that felt sudden and sharp, he was there, just as he had been in my dreamlike state. He was sitting in a worn armchair beside the bed, his coat off, his shirt sleeves rolled up. He looked utterly exhausted, with dark shadows under his eyes and a grim, weary set to his jaw. But his gaze was fixed on me with an unwavering intensity. I was not in my own room. I was in a large, comfortable guest chamber, a fire crackling in the hearth, the bed piled high with warm, heavy quilts. "Eveline," he said, his voice rough with lack of sleep. The sound of my real name on his lips was both a shock and a strange comfort. "What happened?" I whispered, my throat dry and sore. He leaned forward, pouring a glass of water from a pitcher on the bedside table and helping me take a small sip. "You were poisoned," he said, the words blunt, stripped of any euphemism. The doctor confirmed it. My mother's nerve tonic was a tincture of wolfsbane. He said in small, repeated doses, "It mimics the symptoms of a failing heart. The dose she gave you was not small." The clinical horror of his words washed over me. I looked at his face, at the cold, hard fury simmering in his eyes, and I understood. The secret war was over. "Your mother?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Is confined to her rooms," he said, his voice like ice. "I have taken control of the house. The staff answers to me now. She will not hurt you again. I swear it." He was no longer the hesitant, repressed son. The attack on me had unleashed something formidable within him, the true master of the hall. He had chosen a side, and he had chosen me. The knowledge of his fierce, unwavering protection was an overwhelming, humbling thing. To be cared for, to be defended. It was a feeling so foreign to me that it brought tears to my eyes. And with that gratitude came a wave of shame so profound it threatened to drown me. He had saved my life, declared war on his own mother, and risked everything for a woman who wasn't even real. The lie I had built to survive felt like a sickness in my own soul, a poison just as potent as the one his mother had used. I couldn't let it go on. I couldn't let him fight for a ghost. "Calder," I began, my voice cracking with the weight of my confession. He looked at me, his expression softening with concern. "There is something you must know." I took a shaky breath, the truth a painful, terrifying lump in my throat. "My name. It is not Evelina Ward." He didn't move. He just watched me, his stormy eyes searching my face, waiting. The words spilled out of me then, a torrent of shame and desperation. I told him everything, my real name, Eveline Wren, the poverty, the letter that had arrived like a miracle, a temptation I was too weak and hungry to resist. I told him how I had taken another woman's place, how I had lived in terror every single day, and how the lie had grown so large it had taken on a life of its own. I confessed it all, leaving no part of my deception hidden. I finished, my voice a ragged whisper, and looked at him. bracing myself for the fury, the disgust, the inevitable betrayal I knew I deserved. He had saved my life, and I was repaying him with the ultimate deceit. He was silent for a long time, his gaze unwavering. He simply looked at me, and I felt as if he were seeing past the lies, past the fear, and into the very core of who I was. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and filled with a profound, weary sadness that broke my heart. "You lied to survive," he said quietly. "Faced with your choices, I believe I would have done the same." Tears streamed down my face. Tears of relief so powerful they left me breathless. He wasn't angry. He understood. "Your name is the least important thing about you, Eveline," he continued, his voice rough with emotion. "I have spent my entire life surrounded by people who use the truth as a weapon. You told a lie to find shelter from the storm." He reached out and took my hand, his fingers closing around mine, a gesture of complete and unconditional acceptance. "What matters is that you are here, that you are safe." In that moment, lying in a bed I had no right to, holding the hand of a man I had deceived from the very beginning, I felt something I had never felt before in my entire life. I felt like I was home. The quiet, perfect moment was shattered by a firm knock on the chamber door. Riggs entered, his face pale and deeply distressed. He would never have dared to intrude, unless it was a matter of the utmost urgency. "Mr. Langston, sir," the butler said, his voice trembling as he stood in the doorway. "Forgive me. A carriage has just arrived on the main drive. The storm is growing worse, and the driver says the road to the village has washed out." Calder's face tightened with annoyance. "This house is not an inn, Riggs. We are not taking in guests. Send them on their way." Riggs swallowed hard, his eyes darting from Calder to me, a look of pure panic on his face. "That may be difficult, sir," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "The young woman. She is most insistent. She says she was summoned here, that she has a letter of employment." A cold, sickening dread began to creep up my spine. Calder stood up, his voice sharp with impatience. "A letter of employment for what? Who is she?" The butler's gaze fell to the floor. He looked like a man about to announce the end of the world. "Her name, sir," he said, the words falling like stones into the silent room, "is Miss Evelina Ward."
Frost bites the edge of the morning light. A ghost of your shadow lingers in my sight. I reach for the air where you used to stand. Nothing remains but the cold in my hand. Winter's echo calling, through the hollow halls where we were falling. Your name, it fades like breath on glass, a fleeting song the winds will pass. The chapel bells ring, but no one's near. Their lonely toll cut sharp and clear. I whisper your name, it vanishes too, like snow that melts at the sun's first view. The silence hums, the air stands still, time's frozen stream bends to its will. Winter's echo calling, where we once tread.